going to continue now with also discussing the relationship between love and sexuality, or sexual love, and to what extent and in what sense we can see them somehow relating to each other, and why they also seem to have historically and also I think in our times, and maybe always, or this is an open question, to what extent there is a kind of inherent tension between love and sexuality. And tension is maybe not the same thing as a problem here, but why there's a certain, let's say, tension here. So I'm trying to want to somehow reflect on that, and I have to confess that I don't really, in the end, I don't really know how to think about this. So this will be also, will end up in my own impasse or deadlock, and then hopefully that can be like a discussion, opening up our discussion. But I thought that, I mean, I'll start with, let's say that it's a claim or a hypothesis, and I mean very simple, that there seems to be something, and I won't give many examples of this or anything like that, but that there's something about love, and somehow something about sexual love, or I don't know what term to use here. We can use romantic love or something, but a certain form of love or relationship or intimate relationship with which in some way implies sexuality or sexual fulfillment, as somehow being having a place, maybe even in the human psyche, as somehow that which we long for, this kind of deepest longing that we really have is somehow tied in some way to sexuality. And of course, I mean, we might say, although I'm not going to go into it, but at least you could say, well, let's say in spiritual terms, we long for unification with God, or something like that. That there's or that we long to come back home. That there's this nostalgia to somehow that we have somehow, you know, we're detached from that which is really what we are, and we want to, as it were, return to that. That there's something that has in our very constitution that is somehow missing a certain form of satisfaction or unification. Although I won't argue for it, but I'm going to say that, well, you can at least understand that as a certain form of sublimation, let's say, of the idea of sexual love. I'll talk a little bit about that. But anyway, so the proposition here is that there's something about sexual love or sexuality that somehow constitutes an idea or maybe a fantasy of a longing that we have. So something extremely intimate and deep and connected also to our identity, maybe. So that's on the one hand, the idea. And then on the other hand, we have the idea of sex or sexuality as the pinnacle of sin, or the pinnacle of the fallen nature. And of course here, at least for the Western world, of course we have the notion of original sin, which is quite closely tied to sexuality, and maybe you remember the myth of the original sin when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of wisdom of the good and bad. Their eyes opened, and the first thing that they saw is that they were naked, and they felt shame. So in that sense, their nakedness, which here I think you can directly connect to exactly the nakedness of the genitals, or that which is somehow the sexuality, became, as it were, the first instance of, or the first instance of this sin this original sin that we have. And St. Augustine has this depiction of sexuality as the first instance of what he calls the chain of death. So of course that's the whole idea that when we were revealed this nakedness and felt this shame, our sin is exactly what causes also our death. So there's also an intimate link here between sexuality and death also, which is of course one of the big themes of psychoanalytic thinking. I'll say something about that. I mean, I'm not going to require that you know psychoanalytic theory, so I'll talk about it in general terms, but just as flagging that thing. So we have then these two things. On the one hand, this deep longing and this deep maybe feeling that the fulfillment of this longing is somehow the realization of who we really are. That this longing of which is tied to sexuality has something to do with who we really are on the one hand, and then on the other hand, sexuality as exactly the pinnacle of sin. And these seem to be, of course, two completely different, as it were, saying completely two different things, and in tension with each other. And I'll try to say something about that now. Well, I'll take one. I just want to. I'll begin with this one example. I held a course in Finland last spring, or for you last autumn, where we discussed these kinds of things. And there was one student who wrote a seminar essay on, what incel culture, involuntary celibacy, right? Okay. And there has been some discussions about this, and then the idea was that, this guy's thesis was that, well, and he built it on some interviews of rehabilitated incels who have now, come out of their incelness and then report of what the real problem is. And then it's usually said, well, that the problem wasn't really that they didn't get sex, but rather that they were lonely, and things like that. And then the students say, well, that what we really need is just this, not individualized culture, but we need this culture where we take care of each other and we, have a certain kind of a better sense of community, and that people are not alone. But then my reply was just that, okay, let us say that you would have all your friendship, good contacts, intimate relations, and you wouldn't feel alone, but you would never get sex. You would, and nobody, and not even that you wouldn't get, but nobody would be, as it were, attracted by you sexually. So would that be fine for you? And of course, there's a little bit that seems to be I'm not sure. I mean, maybe somebody can really think that. I'm not really sure. I mean, that would be maybe if there's something like asexuality, then that might be the definition of it. Whether or not that's a real phenomenon is, in that sense, a real phenomenon of that you can really be asexual in that sense. I'm not sure, but at least we see already in that example that it's not really clear how we could see ourselves as a kind of a fulfilled human life where sexuality would somehow be completely dislodged from that. And that seems also kind of a weird thing. So there's something, already in that example, just taking that example, to saying that there's something about maybe our sense of identity, at least, that is quite intimately woven with this desire to be recognized in a certain sexual manner. Okay. So that's as a starting point. Now I want to take, I mean, there's two different themes that I want to discuss, and the first one has to do with this intimate relation between identity and sexuality, and I want to discuss the Christian tradition and specifically the way in which St. Augustine has been one of the formative or I would say that Augustine's idea of sexuality and identity, or sexuality and the self, the relation that he, as it were, develops, has been very formative for the Western, or what we nowadays maybe want to call the globalized industrial consumerist perception, self-understanding, and then consider that a little bit together with Foucault's ideas of which specifically has in the history of sexuality, where Foucault's main, I won't go in, but I'm just kind of giving you references here, that Foucault has a certain kind of challenges this idea that sexuality has, that the sexual liberation that we witnessed since the 60s, that has been, as it were, a radical challenging of power, of state power or cultural power, but rather is an extension or a new deployment of that power, and that sexual identity in that sense is power nowadays, in a very strong sense. So I mean, let's say on the surface level, it seems to be the question is, well, if you have a culture that has, and you take again the picture of the original sin, a culture that has, as it were, condemned sexuality as being sinful somehow in a very deep manner. So how has that culture, its cultural evolution, produced this radical sexual liberation, where sexuality is also seen as the most deepest thing, maybe, that you find your own identity by finding your sexual identity or gender identity, but I would say that gender is always connected to sexual identity, but we can discuss that. So how is it? And of course, I mean, maybe the central narrative usually nowadays is that, well, you know, there was this oppression, and then and now we have freed oppression, we have freed ourselves from power, and that means that we then move to this liberation, and that emancipation happens here. But I think Foucault's point, or in order to get, we can kind of understand this, Foucault's point that what has happened is not, as it were, revolution against power, but power transmuted rather. And if we go back to St. Augustine's idea of sexuality as somehow the pinnacle of, or the first instance of original sin, of course you see there that there's the very way in which you identify sexuality as somehow the first or the deepest root of sin is already a way in which you place the self identity or the self in an extremely intimate relation with sexuality. Of course, now in terms of a certain negativity. So I am who I really am in my purest sense, exactly understood in a certain kind of fundamental negative relation to sexuality. And that, of course, has, I mean, from this perspective, we would say, well, then culture has wanted to repress or depress or control sexuality exactly in order to maintain and understand, or to, as it were, guard our true selves against that which corrupts our true self or displaces us. So in that sense, in the negative, and then you would have the narrative, well, you know, then we liberate ourselves from this stupid idea that we had, and then we're able to, as it were, be free. But that is, you can see already here that narrative already would then result in that we in fact recognize and embrace the very way in which Christianity from its beginning, or from St. Augustine at least, have placed sexuality and identity so extremely close to each other. So that's one point in which you could read Foucault as seeing exactly that well, it's not that we have simply repressed and now we're liberated, but we see that this liberation that we have is exactly the product of that repression in itself. So it's not radically free, and Foucault then has an idea that, well, the only way of really freeing us from this repression of sexuality is to, in a certain way, stop talking about sexuality, because it's the deployment of the speech of sexuality that has created this. Well, anyway, I mean, but the story is in that sense also a little bit more, well, not more complicated, but it has this twist, because exactly in the way in which the Christian tradition has linked sexuality and the self together, is that there was St. Augustine had also he had earlier, before he had his conversion to Christianity, he was associated with them, in English, Manichaeans. Is that the right pronunciation? Okay. With the Manichaeans, and the Manichaeans, I mean, just roughly put, it's like a Persian, with Persian origins, a kind of a maybe mystical cult or theological perception, where, and one of their keystones was to condemn sexuality in itself as such, as evil, as being part of the evil principle of the universe. And St. Augustine, then his point is to say, well, no, sexuality cannot be as such evil, because the devil is in this sense not equal to God. It's not the equal principle. So if there is something like sexuality in the world, and if we have reproduction, and we read the Bible, and we see that, well, reproduction was something that God, as it were, gave us and commanded or gave us this mission to reproduce, and this was already in paradise before the fall. We were, as it were, given the gift of reproduction, in that sense of sexuality also. So it cannot be, in itself, it cannot be bad. But after the fall, and here in the secularized world, it is always bad, and it's always connected to sin. And Augustine's example here is a little bit bizarre example, but he gives this example that, well, we see this, how this exactly the way in which sexuality is connected with sin is the way in which it marks our fundamental split between the soul and the body, or the body and the will. So the point, his point here is that you're supposed to, that when you get sexually aroused, and his example is of himself, the penis goes up, is erect, without your consent, as it were, without your will. It just reacts, it turns. And Augustine's point is that, well, it's your penis will be, in terms of sexuality, it will be in rebellion, stand up in rebellion, in the same way as man stood up in rebellion towards God's will. So this is God, as it were, punishes human beings, and sexuality is the first punishment, because the penis stands up in rebellion to my will, in the same way as I stood up, or man stood up in rebellion to God's will. Okay, so this is the myth, as it were. But then you see, so in that sense, in the secularized world, the whole point is that you're supposed to, of course, in that sense, condemn homosexuality is fundamentally problematic, but not because sex is problematic fundamentally, but rather then the vision is when we return to paradise with union with God, then we will not have this split between the will or the soul and the body, but rather it will be, as it were, they will be fused. And for Augustine, well, you can read it two ways. Either Augustine means, well, in paradise we will just, as it were, reproduce rationally. So, okay, we should have children, and then I will myself to be sexually aroused, and then we make children. Or then, of course, you can read it the other way and think that it gives expression for Augustine's, as it were, ressentiment, that finally in paradise he'll be able to walk around and fuck around as much as he wants to, because it won't be sinful anymore. So, but that's depends a little bit on how you read that. Anyway, and my point here is that to the extent we have something like a secularization that has happened, and the way in which sexual liberation has been part of this secularization of our society, if for St. Augustine the point was that, well, sexuality and love can be unified in paradise, then the idea is, or sexuality and the self can be unified in paradise. Now, of course, to the extent that we has, as it were, don't live for the afterlife anymore. I mean, society is not organized, politics is not organized like that, and the narratives of the selves are not organized like that at all, but rather it's, as it were, and this is something, Charles Taylor has this this description of that the secularization is fundamentally about the pursuit of human fulfillment in the secular world. Which I think, I mean, has a lot to it. So in that sense, you would say that the liberation or emancipation of sexuality is in that sense connected to becomes, as it were, an imperative that we liberate our own sexuality, because to the extent ourselves and sex has been already from the very beginning of Western culture intimately tied to each other, and whereas we cannot hope in that sense in this narrative for that realization to happen in paradise, it has to happen, as it were, here. So in that sense there's a certain kind of narrative, you could say, that goes like that. And of course then Foucault also has these descriptions, the historical descriptions of how the discourse on sex changes from its moral perspective to its fundamentally medical perspective, and it becomes a part of the healthy human being. So sex and perversions are not anymore moral corruptions, they're, as it were, symptoms of a disease, or symptoms of some kind of malfunction in the natural state of human beings. And I think we're quite close also today. I mean, it's quite usual that we talk about sex exactly and part of this, that it's part of the healthy life. So the more we suppress things, that's bad for us. So we should just embrace things, and then we become healthy. It's part of our healthy nature. So these kinds of descriptions are there in Foucault also. Well, but by this I just wanted to kind of maybe problematize, first of all, this idea that what we think of as sexual liberation is somehow liberation exactly in terms of that it would, as it were, be able to understand or deal with the basic problem or the basic tension between sexuality and something we would call, well, the self, but also in terms of sexuality and love. So the question, I mean, so the whole question is, why is it at all that we have these types of mythologies, for instance, in the Bible, that sex is on the one hand becomes something that we long for very much, that is somehow intimately tied to ourselves, and on the other hand are sinful? Because the myth, of course, doesn't explain it. It, as it were, presents that problematic in itself. So I'm going to try and, to present at least one way or one attempt at, as it were, accounting for that split in psychoanalytical terms. And specifically, it comes, or my proposal is that it has something to do, and here exactly comes where I don't really know how to, what's really going on here, because it's quite an open question for me still, but that it has, I mean, I propose that it has something to do with what's usually termed as as incest taboo, or the prohibition of incest, prohibition. Now, as a quick, just to, as it were, frame it for you, that what's going on here, why talk about incest taboo, is that if we talk about, I mean, if we take these two notions, on the one hand, the longing for something like sexuality, and somehow the intimacy that it has to do with our notion of ourselves, maybe our identity, on the one hand, and maybe also love, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, sin, or sin as prohibition also. Sin as something which somehow is there, that sexuality is somehow perceived as coming with, maybe originally coming with a certain kind of law or demand that says that this is not forbidden. So, and this was we find maybe the first instances of an attempt to kind of frame up this kind of tension in Freud's Totem and Taboo book. I don't know if you know, but there's this, Freud gives us a kind of a mythology. I'm not really sure, maybe Joel knows better. Sometimes I get this feeling that Freud presents this, the idea of the primal herd as somehow really, that it really empirically maybe was something like that. But I'm going to read it rather as just presenting a kind of a picture of a certain logic that's there. So this myth that Freud constructs of this primal scene is the idea that you have something like the pre-human, ape humans that lived in this herd where you had the alpha male, the father, who possessed all the women and denied sexual access of all the other males, which were of course his own kindred, access to the mothers and to the daughters and other females. And of course these poor pre-humans got hugely envious and raged against, at some point planned that they're going to kill the father, and so they kill the father, and then they have everything, they get free access, as it were, to these, to their, and in this myth, of course, they're their own siblings, because everybody is, in a certain sense, kind of part of the one and the same family and herd. So, so they get access to them, but then Freud says that they have, they're struck by this sense of guilt of killing the father. So in order to compensate for this guilt, they, as it were, erect the dead father as this super ego for the herd, and then starts and then abides, gives the law that starts to prohibit their sexual relations in the herd. So the dead father's law comes back, as it were, with the vengeance, and enters this. So I mean, well, this is one of the scenes that Freud gives, and of course the problematic is completely unclear why these pre-humans felt guilt at all, and I don't think Freud is able to account for that. But one of the points is that the Oedipal complex, which I don't know. Do you know the basic structure of the Oedipus complex, which is basically this: that every son wants to fantasizes of killing his father in order exactly to have or possess or be able to make love with the mother, and that this. So the point here is that this complex, this love triangle complex, is there, and the unconscious fantasies are there exactly because there's a fundamental prohibition, and in the Oedipal structure by exactly the father structure, the father figure, that prevents, that prohibits incest between the infant and the mother. Now, so then just to pause, I mean, so if you just take this structure, you start to get a certain sense. Well, of course, to the extent that there is that every infant has, let's call it a sensual or erotic relationship to its first caretaker, specifically the mother. You have the breast, and it's filled of all kinds of different erotic and sensual, as it were, realizations: caressing, taking care of, nourishing, washing, hugging, and of course the breast and sucking and things like that are all part of stimulations of erogenous zones. And this is of course the fundamental way in which we also are love relations in a certain way, or are formed. But with this weird thing, that something which we would call now sexuality in terms of exactly maybe intercourse, but not only that, but a certain kind of sexual fulfillment is somehow prohibited. And so then there you get these two things. So there's something fundamentally, as it were, not realized in the basic or constitutive relations, love relation that you have, something that is not realized, thus the longing idea. And on the other hand, it's not realized exactly because what you, as it were, phantasmatically are missing there is that which is prohibited or put as it were as a sin, something which you are not allowed to do. Just say quickly, if Freud more or less thinks that this is somehow that the essential thing for Freud is that there is this prohibition, although he's not able to explain why this prohibition really comes into. It's somehow, it is there. There is something, as it were, something that comes from outside that prohibits the sexual incestuous relation between the infant, and of course the infant here is both men and or girls and boys, that prohibits this this realization. Then for Lacan, which we talked yesterday, has a little bit different reading of the Oedipus complex, where he, as it were, analyzes Freud rather, that what the Oedipus complex, according to Freud, what this gives expression is that it in fact, there Freud reveals his own desire and his own need for the dead father and the prohibition. So it's not that it as it were, comes from simply outside, but it's somehow structurally part of, this is Lacan's suggestion, structurally part of what it means somehow to be an individual or a subject, and that there's a certain kind of necessary prohibition that is fantasized then, or placed, or animated or dramatized as in the Oedipus complex. So you, as it were, create the dead father, the father that is supposed to, as it were, that we need, but with this ambivalence that it's also a kind of a wish for the death of the father, exactly because it has this longing aspect to it also. And for Lacan then also says that, well, that this prohibition comes from what he calls that this prohibition, the need to have this father that comes there and prohibits, arises from the infant's let's say, fear, a kind of unconscious fear or ambivalent fear in relation to what Lacan calls the crocodile mother, the mother who is the all-embracing, and the mother's desire who is the all-embracing and threatens to, as it were, consume completely the infant itself, and giving no space for the infant to be a singular person. But on the other hand, you also have the prohibition because there's a certain kind of longing exactly for this unification, this phantasmatic unification of fully being satisfied, fully being recognized by the mother. So the prohibition works here as a defense against this, as it were, death drive, in a certain sense, that which, so the prohibition here is structurally that which is necessary, a necessary condition for subjectivity or individuality. So maybe you see the difference here between Freud and Lacan in that sense, that simply that it's not simply something that just comes there from society, but rather that the organizing principle of individuality and society comes through the necessity of that prohibition. Well, I'll leave Lacan here now, and I'll just check the time. Okay, we have good time. So please, I mean, ask questions if anything is if anything's unclear. Now, the reason why I'm taking this is, first of all, I mean, I think that there's something to this idea. At least it seems to me clear that that there is something like an incest taboo and a necessity in relation to the incest taboo, but not that exactly that the incest taboo is rather it's an expression that we have this taboo exactly as an expression of a certain impossibility in the incestuous relation, and that I mean, simply put, that the notion of taboo here as a certain organizing principle for society is rather let's say it's a kind of outsourcing or a mythologizing of a certain kind of problematic of love and sexuality or attention that they have. But as I said, I don't really know in the end how to think about this. But I'm going to just present it now. So, but I don't think. And I think it's a little bit unclear also for Lacan what he thinks that this, where this, as it were, the necessity of the prohibition or the necessity of that, as it were, restriction or the comes in, and what it is that really is. I mean, how to maybe not explain, but to understand and describe what it is that is impossible somehow with this incestuous relation. Of course, impossibility, of course, here doesn't mean impossible in the sense of ontologically impossible. Of course, there can be incestuous relations. That's no impossibility at all. But rather on the that I'm more interested in wanting to understand how that impossibility has something to do with love, and how that impossibility, as it were, in certain sense, comes out of love. But here I'll need your help soon, because I don't know how it is. And we've been talking with Joel, and we have he's got some ideas, but let's see. I mean, the funny thing here is that it seems to be, or maybe one way of kind of putting this this distinction or this tension between sexuality and love. I mean, I'm talking now about love in its as it were unconditional sense, which we were talking about yesterday, and the way in which that unconditional love is also, I mean, in our primordial relations, is also always connected with sensuality and something which, in a certain sense, later on, of course, from the infant, becomes inseparable from what sexuality is. So that's the point. I'm not saying that the child is sexual in a sense that adults are, definitely not, but inseparably, what happens between the mother and the child will inseparably be related to what sexuality is for it later on. So that's my point. I mean, just in the sense that if you couldn't have, as it were, the types of enjoyments and stimulations and satisfactions that you have in your relationship with the primary caretaker, it would be impossible to understand what sexual enjoyment and what would be at all enjoyable about that. So of course, in some sense, what is enjoyable about sexuality is connected to what's enjoyable with your first relation with your mother. Well, anyway, so I mean, in that sense, there's a certain kind of, and here I'm not really sure how to think about it, but I'll just put it forth that it seems to me that there comes this kind of two double primary commands in relation to, or we are formed by, in a certain way, two primary or primordial commands. So yesterday I said that this notion of unconditional love, in certain way, I think, as Levinas says, or I think rightly says, that there's something about this unconditional address, or the way in which we are addressed and the way in which we care for other people unconditionally, that comes with a certain kind of command that thou shalt not kill, that you cannot do anything that's against, as it were, the caring in itself. But then, so it seems to be, so we have that command, but then we also have the command, one of the primordial commands is that, or alongside it, we seem to have this command that thou shalt not fuck thy mother. Excuse the language, but in a certain sense, so it seems to have the same kind of, or not the same kind of, maybe not at all the same kind of, but a certain kind of, it's in, I gather, as irreducible to us as the command of love. But of course, it's not a command. So my question here is, and this, I think, I don't know how to go forward from this point, is that somehow this second command against incestuous relations somehow must be related to or understood in the light of love, because otherwise it doesn't really, it's very hard to see how or from where that prohibition, as it were, that impossibility might come. But here I'm having a little bit problems of seeing what that, what that would mean. I mean, first of all, I mean, one way of putting it is of course to understand it in relation to sorry, I forgot the term, like pedophilia, in terms of that there's a certain kind of, let's say, impossibility from the perspective of love to have pedophilic relations. So, and why is that? Well, I mean, if we put it very simply, and I think, I mean, we can put it, maybe there's more to it than this, but simply put, that it seems to me that that if I, for instance, get aroused by a small child, and now of course, by the way, when I'm putting this prohibition, it's not simply that it comes from the infant side, of course, that's the whole point, but it comes exactly as much from the adult side, that the adult, as it were, in a certain sense, from the adult's perspective, love it doesn't have the prohibition in the sense maybe that it needs a prohibition to say that you shouldn't, you know, try to use your child as sexually, but it somehow singles out that it is an impossibility from my perspective of my love to the child. So in that sense, I mean, you could say that, well, what would be the difficulty? What's the impossibility from the perspective of love in relation to to a small child? Well, one of the things is, of course, that it's let's say that there's a very fundamentally different thing for what sexuality is for a child than for an adult. How to really describe that? I don't think it's not really easy. I mean, if I just take, I mean, as an example from any, like a real life example, if I would imagine myself, as it were, to get aroused by a small child, maybe my own child, and as it were, try to engage in that sexuality, I see fundamentally that it's impossible for me to, as it were, in the sense that sexuality somehow is, from love's perspective at least, has something to do but about how the way in which my love or my desire is expressed now in sexual terms, how that is somehow received in that particular sexual mode, let's put it like that, by the other, and as it were, invited in and taken in by me. So that is what I would say, I mean, simply put, what sexuality, how sexuality and love are fundamentally together, and how all sexuality that somehow doesn't apply to this or doesn't do like this is always going to be problematic in relation to, or is always, love is always going to, as it were, create bad conscience for sexuality in that sense. So that, from that perspective, it seems completely impossible for me to imagine from love's perspective. But I see a question coming. Okay, yeah. And from my perspective, if I would look at the child, I mean, I have a small, or not so small child anymore, but when you're so small, and you still see that there's, that even, I mean, that the way in which children are, of course, what's it called? Erogeneously active and you know, interested and feel that they would, in a certain sense, you even could get this feeling that, well, there would be nothing that, for instance, my son, when he was young, that there would be no problem if I would go and stimulate him or in all kinds of ways for him. But what would be impossible is if I would do that with my own sexuality, as it were, because that would, in a fundamental, in a way in which is somehow not compatible with whatever with our love, in a certain sense, between ourselves, I would become, in a certain sense, something, well, monstrous or something. But we were talking about this, that here's a certain kind of unclarity, really, how to think about it. But at least there's something about that event that is somehow infused with that problematic. But I think specifically what I said earlier about this love and sexuality, that I would propose that the prohibition, as it were, comes from exactly the way in which love and sexuality is impossible in these incestuous relations. Of course, then you could ask, well, you know, when the child grows up and is adult, what's the problem then? Because it's not anymore this pedophilic sense. There I don't really know anymore what to say about that, other than somehow it seems quite obvious, but I don't know how to theorize that really sufficiently. I mean, somehow it seems to be that at least they become a little bit too simplified. Any ideas that I would have would be something like, you know, well, somehow if there would be a realized incestuous relation in this all the time, that would somehow fundamentally corrupt or disentangle or not disentangle, but destruct something of a psychic core in that sense, to the extent exactly that this primal caretaker is in a way there as someone that has, I don't know, been exactly the cornerstone of this prohibition, and the prohibition in the fundamental sense is exactly what is an expression of love in that sense. So that would, and somehow I'm formed by that, but I don't really know how far that really could go, but it would be something. Do you have any?
No, well, but just to general things, I mean, they don't, decide anything yet.
Yeah.
But just one thing which I think you said it already in a sense, but that of course, insofar as sexuality is an expression of love, it means, I would say, now in general terms, not just in relationship to children or to our own children, but sexuality, if it's an expression, to the extent that it's an expression of love, it means that what you desire from the other is their desire.
Exactly.
That you don't want to do anything to them that they don't want you to do. That's the whole point. That immediately, if you sense that they don't want you to do what you would otherwise want to do, you will lose your desire.
Yeah.
Because you don't have a desire of your own that's independent of the other's desire. On the contrary, your desire is for your two desires to meet. In a way, you could say that you desire the other person. So if the other person isn't there, you don't desire to go where the other person is.
Exactly.
And so you don't want to. It's not that you need to like restrain yourself from going where the other doesn't want you to go. It's that you feel no desire to go there. The other isn't there. It's not the place.
Exactly.
To be. And that means, I suppose, in relationship to children, including our own children, is that sexuality, because they are children, they don't understand, they don't have sexuality in the same way. So they can't, if you start playing out your sexuality with them, on them, you will be playing the game with them that they don't understand. They might think it's fine, but that's because they don't know what you're doing, and then they start realizing, in fact, pretty soon, that something strange is going on precisely because you are playing your own game that they can't really be
exactly.
part of. And that kind of thing, by the way, of course, is problematic also in all kinds of other ways, not just sexually. The way we treat children, that we often like bring them into our games. For instance, we kind of politicize children. In a way, that we now tell children all the time in schools that they should be all protesting on the street against the climate destruction or whatever. Make them our political puppets. They don't understand any of this shit, but we can actually make them feel guilty about things that they don't know about.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's, it's not as bad of a transgression or as actual pedophilia, but it's a kind of political pedophilia.
Sure.
To bring them in that sense to our little games. And we do it all the time, of course, with children when we're like making jokes on there. We think that it's so cute when they try to act like adults and we sort of, they can't understand what we see in them, what we think is funny and so on. And that's always a problem.
Yeah.
when you use people for your own amusement, let's say.
Sure.
So that's one thing, and then the other general thing I think is that in terms of incest now, it is also that it's not just sexuality, but that the basic thing about being a parent is that you try to teach the child, help the child to become independent of you. And that's the whole point.
Mm.
If you can't do that, you have completely failed as a parent. If you can't make the child be their own person independent
Yeah.
of you. And that means not only that you shouldn't, use your child as for your sexual gratification and make the child sexually independent of you. You should also not, you shouldn't make your child your best friend. That's also wrong. It's not really. It's not good if your mother is your best friend or your father is your best friend. I shouldn't have that. I should find my own fucking friends and not make my own child be my friend. And the child should be forced to do it.
Sure.
Should have her own friends.
Yeah.
So in all kinds of ways in which we prevent our children from becoming, free in that sense.
Yeah.
In their own is always a problem.
Exactly.
Sexuality is a very strong way
Of
doing that.
exactly.
So maybe you would in that sense think of the incest that was much broader just sexuality.
Yeah.
Sexuality is
Yeah. No, I think that's, yeah, I think that's...
And then if you think in terms of then later in life, you say, so okay, so now if I'm having a good parent, that means that my child is now completely independent of me. And couldn't we then, because then we are just doing it around, but of course, it doesn't work like that at all, because, or at least you would then ask, why would you want to, if you're the child, why would you then want to go for your mother or your father?
Yeah, yeah.
If you are actually really independent of them, because the only reason would be, I think, that you are not actually independent.
Yeah.
There's some kind of really reverse
Exactly.
thing going on. So,
Yeah. You had a...
I think that in the bringing the child into a game that he or she can't understand and can fully participate and can match our desire with her or his desire. I think that in every field the child or the other person loses autonomy. So that could be a source of prohibition and
exactly. Yeah. The autonomy, but I think that my point was just that autonomy in itself must be understood through love, because otherwise, it seems that if you don't understand that, then you always have, well, why is autonomy good? So in a certain sense, you have to understand that somehow in relation to love. And of course, I agree with exactly that you need to be independent. Well, why? What is it about that independence that it's important? So somehow you have to understand that in the way in which, in love and exactly somehow in the very encounter that you have, somehow there is what makes whatever prohibition is in the real encounter that you have with the child in your loving relation. But I was coming also to this, which Joel said, that there's something about, well, first of all, it's of course incestuous is somehow broader, a broader phenomenon, but it's also, the intensity with which sexuality has, why it's so potent, I gather, in all cultures, why sexual relations is one of the first principles of organizing, the distribution of sexual relations, why that is such an important part of all cultural, tells something about that of course it has this general characterization, I think, but exactly why it has this double effect of this kind of weird longing thing and phantasmatic longing, and on the other hand is that it's the most sinful thing that you could imagine. But I think that exactly let's say explains why we have this kind of weird doubleness here. is that because there's also, I mean, that there, why the longing? Why is this longing, as it were, left there in sexuality? Why do we invest the sexuality with so much? And I would say that from love's perspective, you wouldn't invest. There is no need to invest that, because from love's perspective, whatever incestuous taboo, the taboo is not, I mean, it's a certain way completely empty, because it doesn't prohibit anything. I mean, love doesn't prohibit anything. I mean, it makes it impossible in the sense exactly that it's impossible in the way that it doesn't, from love's perspective, it doesn't mean anything, the sexual. So it's not that I have to restrain myself because love demands me to restrain myself, that, or we need a prohibition. So in that sense, I mean, the whole way in which sexuality somehow has this looming longing attached to it, I would say is always a sign of a problematic with love. And that's, you know, you take the Hollywood scenarios, I gather one of the basic examples is that very longing that it's inscribed with, and as it were, inscribes any narrative with this weird enjoyment of a fulfillment, is, I think, a betrayal of love in many ways.
Sure, it's longing in what sense? Because in one sense, longing is of course part of
exactly.
love
Yeah,
itself.
yeah.
It's just
Exactly. But when it's a certain kind of longing for a sexual, let's say, for a sexual unity, it's somehow, I mean, but it's, but maybe the words are, of course, I mean, it's true that, of course, we long for people, and also, I mean, long for touching and contact. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying to the extent it has this aspect of, let's say, the ideological dimension of it, that it has this idea that if we just fulfill this thing, then, as it were, love has been fulfilled. I think that then it has a certain kind of it has a certain kind of blindness to it, because it seems to function as if exactly on the premise that there was something that was missed out, as it were, in this fundamental relation, something which couldn't be actualized, and now we're searching for that actualization, and in this sense that if you take the Oedipal complex idea that Freud and Lacan draws us, is the whole idea is that, well, you have to exchange your mother for another girl, or then in women's case for Lacan, I think at least, that then you have to the function of the father here is a way in which you get, as it were, access to the mother, but these are the kind of sexual differences. But the whole point is that this idea that you still keep the image of the mother somehow as that which, as in a certain sense, is there, that you should that stands as the paradigm for what the type of satisfaction that you would want to have, and which is always connected exactly, I think Lacan here is right, with this fantasy of a certain type of unity that you come into, a unity where you, in a certain sense, disappear in yourself, where the other is somehow absolutely for you, and you don't really have, as it were, any individuality, or you don't have a relationship, rather, but you have this kind of symbiotic unity. So in that sense, to the extent those types of ideas drive us, that we just, you know, get another object, replace mother with another object, then that functions has the type of function of ideology, I think, that you have present in all kinds of different narratives.
And
but
that's certainly what Freud says, that it's every the paradigm of every sexual satisfaction is the implant and the rest.
Yeah, exactly.
Just is like
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. But I'm not saying that. I mean, I'm not saying that sexuality as such is this. But I'm just saying that to the extent there is what I identified as a certain type of longing that might be understood exactly longing in the terms of that it has something fundamentally to do. It's a fundamental intimacy about who I am. That there's something that has been missing from this, and that's why I search for sexual satisfaction or sexual identity in this sense. So that was my point, just that to the extent that is, as it were, the paradigm, it's not about love, because it seems to be exactly about the replacement, a question about replacing an object that was prohibited by me because of some kind of, whatever system. But my point is that it's not a prohibition exactly in that sense, but it's love in itself, which simply doesn't, love doesn't, from love's perspective, incestuous relations is not a question. It's simply non-existence in that sense. So it's not a prohibition at all. So from the perspective...
It's non-existent in the sense that there is no desire.
Exactly. It's of course you can know it, and of course you can feel some kind of anxious relation to it, but I think it's always coupled somehow with a certain difficulty with love in that sense, and not about and not with something, let's say, or some a difficulty with love. So I think that the way in which we describe, or the way in which sexuality shows itself from the perspective of love is radically different than from this perspective where we have the longing for this object that we're going to be. So in that sense, it was just a way in which also to understand this relation between identity and sexuality, and exactly this longing and why it's so problematic. So that was, but I think we have to, in order to be able to get some food, I'll stop here, and then we meet up. Are you coming? You're coming. It would be great. Yeah.
So it's that we'll do 3 to